share experiences in this masterclass. So over to the FSRBs. Thank you. Let's put our hands together for them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, delegates, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to this masterclass on assessing countries' compliance with FATF Recommendation 8. And with me to deliver this masterclass, I have my class masters and mistresses. Hence, it's a masterclass. My panelists, immediately on my left, this is Mr. Bohit, and he is from the FSRB in Central Africa, Gabak. After Bohit, we have Miss Moreni. Moreni is from the FSRB in the Eastern and Southern Africa, SMLAC. And next to Moremi, we have Mr. Emil Medi. Emil Medi is from the Directorate of Research and Policy of the FSRB here in West Africa, Djaba. And last but not the least, we have Ms. Gina Wood, who's also from Djaba, from the Evaluation and Compliance Directorate. Myself, my name is Momodu Saho. I am also from the Djaba Secretariat, a policy officer working in the Directorate of Policy and Research. And I will be moderating this session. It's a panel discussion, as you can see, and we will try to manage this time very well, given that we have already lost some time. And my role is to enhance the discussions with the panelists, manage time, but also at the end of the panel discussions, maybe open the floor so that we could have few questions or contributions to the panelists. So thank you so much. As it has been said already, we are all from the FSRBs, Financial Action Task Force, regional style bodies. And our role, one of our roles is to evaluate member states in terms of their compliance with the FATF recommendations. That is one of our key mandates and responsibilities. So we are having a discussion today in relation to evaluation or assessing countries' compliance with regards to FATF Recommendation 8. So to start this discussion, I would like to pose this question to Mr. Emil Medi from Djaba. And the question is, Mr. Medi, the pursuant to the revision of the FATF Recommendation 8, what would you say are the most important changes that countries should make, that is to ensure effective monitoring of NPOs? That is, the recommendation has been revised, and we want to know what are the most important changes that countries should make to ensure there is effective monitoring of NPOs. And you have 3 minutes to respond to this, Mr. Medi.
Thank you so much, and I am glad to be here. Quickly, before I proceed answering, I know we don't have enough time. I also want to acknowledge Professor Shehu, who is First Director General of Djaba and my mentor as well. Prof, welcome. Yes, so let me quickly move to the question. I think we've had a lot of conversations in our earlier discussions, so I'll be brief also because of time. we will all recall that around 2023, the FATF had to revise Recommendation 8. And after the revision, they also published a best practice paper. And somewhere 2024, the assessment methodology itself was also updated to reflect the new changes to the recommendation. And for us to highlight the changes, we would also have to understand why the change was effected. Because as we've all heard from the previous session, implementation of Recommendation 8 was creating a lot of unintended consequences. The civic space was being stifled, over-regulation issues, NPOs were being de-risked, they were having challenges in assessing financial institutions and all that. And so, globally, it became a concern. And because we know the critical role the NPOs play, I always say that the NPOs play roles that even central government, with all the resources, will not be able to. They go to the dangerous places and all that. So we've acknowledged the fact that the NPOs are critical. And so it was important the recommendation was revised to be able to create enough space for the NPOs to operate. So quickly, what are some of the changes? And I'll highlight about 4 of them. One is about a shift from the all-round approach to a risk-based approach. That not all the NPOs should be put under strict monitoring, just as we do within the financial sector, for example, which means that, first of all, there must be a risk assessment to understand the risk exposure of the NPOs. The FATF says that, first of all, we must identify the NPOs that meet the FATF definition of NPOs, which means that right from the beginning, the recommendation acknowledges that not all NPOs meet the FATF definition of NPOs. So we need to do a scoping note to identify those that meet that definition. And then we go ahead and then assess the level of tier vulnerability of these NPOs, so that we'll be able to know the ones that fall within the high, medium, low categories and all that. Now, once we are done, there is a need for us to ensure that our monitoring is in line with the risks that we've identified. So, which means that our monitoring should not be changing the NPO sector into a reporting entity kind of, as we've heard in the earlier discussion, where some countries ended up classifying the NPOs as DNFDPs, and for that matter, exerting them to all the preventive measures as contained in the FATF recommendation. No, the monitoring is to ensure that we are detecting and taking enough measures to prevent the TF from achieving what they would want to achieve. So, risk-based approach. After we identify the high-risk NPOs, we would have to focus our supervision towards those high-risk NPOs. Another one is consultation, which is important. The NPO players themselves understand their sector best. I don't see a correct evidence-based risk assessment of NPOs being conducted without the involvement of the sector players. So we need the sector players deeply involved in the entire risk assessment process, so that whatever measures we are adopting to mitigate this risk, it is done in consultation with the sector. We expect them to comply. So the best way is to involve them in the process of coming up with these measures, so that all of us will be on the same page when implementing these measures. That is also another change that I think we would have to take note of. Now, implementation must also be inclusive and regularly monitored. It's also another one. Competent authorities will need to engage the NPO regulators, the FIUs, law enforcement, NPO sector, all of them, so that together it is the country taking measures to prevent TF from materializing. It is not about just targeting a particular NPO sector. I'm using my words carefully because these are some of the concerns that have been coming forth here and there, for which the FATF had to revise the recommendation. Finally, because of time, the safeguards we are putting in place must be in line with the risks identified. The essence of the risk assessment is not the cover for each praise. It is for us to implement measures in line with the risks we identified. Once we are implementing the measures in line with risks identified, then I think it will help us to shift from looking at the entire NPO sector as a high-risk entity to addressing specific risks that we have identified. So mitigating measures must be in line with the risks identified so that together we are taking enough adequate, proportionate, and risk-based measures to ensure the sector doesn't end up in the hands of those who we don't want to. At the same time, they're also performing the critical role that they ought to provide in order to support humanity. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Medi, for setting the scene for this discussion. And my apologies once again, Dr. Shehu, our first Professor Dr. Abdullahi Shehu. It's an honor to be part of this masterclass that you have graced this afternoon. He is the first Director General of JABA, and he has been the one responsible for the success that JABA is enjoying today. So we thank you so much, Professor. So thank you, Emil. Emil has set the scene. If I can recall, he said it's a total shift from a blanket approach to a risk-based approach. That is, we need to identify the risk, assess the risk, and also understand. So once we have done that, then we apply the measures that are commensurate to the risk that we have identified. But he also mentioned that consultation is also another key change that has been mentioned in the revised standards. That is to ensure in the risk assessment process, in the monitoring process, and all the other measures that we are to take as a country, we ensure there is a broad consultation with the sector as well. So to build on to Emil's introduction, I want to invite Ms. Gina Wood. And Ms. Wood, we know that the FATF Recommendation 8 is often one of the most misunderstood recommendations. So we want to find out, in your view, what are the main reasons for this persistent misunderstanding, given that there has been some guidance and FATF best practice papers on NPOs. So that is the question for Ms. Wood, and you also have 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saho. I will be amiss if I also do not pay homage to Professor Shehu. He was also my mentor. That is, and he continues being my mentor since 2009 when I joined JABA. And I am glad to say that I contributed to seeing Yibekwa Foundation to where it is today, though little that I did. He was my mentor and I was his tormentor. So for your question, yes, indeed, the NPO sector has been the most misunderstood. That is, Recommendation 8 has been the most misunderstood FATF recommendation, even from 8 days of being the Special Recommendation 8. And I'd like to say that it's been quite difficult, and most countries even continue finding it difficult. And I am very glad that we are where we are today because of the likes of the Space for Change and also Civic Advisor Hub, because I recall that Civic Advisor Hub, I think we met, Uganda was the first country to be really hammered regarding its implementation of FATF Recommendation 8. And during the mutual evaluation of Nigeria, so I think we mentioned that the international NPOs or the NPOs appear to have some sort of grasp on the requirements of Recommendation 8. And I'm happy to say that, well, we have been part of Nigeria's story to be the only country to be assessed as having compliance for Recommendation 8. So with that said, this has been very difficult because most countries see implementation of the FATF standards. It's like looking at it from the point of copying and pasting what is supposed to be implemented by financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions. And I saw that in my country, Ghana, where NPOs were also identified as reporting entities and were requested to fully comply with the FATF recommendations. And I'd like to emphasize that this also came from the fact that they did not consider NPOs as not for profit, because NPOs are not generating profit. So you cannot expect them to use donor funding to implement the FATF standards as banks are doing. Another concern was also to confuse vulnerability with suspicion. So this is the reason why when they understand that, okay, we don't know what is happening in the NPO sector. Yes, we heard that they can be vulnerable, looking at where they are operating and the rest, so they become suspicious. So instead of understanding what is really going on by going through the dialogue with them and also trying to understand the FATF standards, they rather decided to apply the FATF standards in a way that they think will bring the NPOs to line. That is, prepping the horse to make sure that it toes the line and it moves in that direction. So the lack of understanding of the FATF standard itself is the basis of the very big problem that we had regarding implementation of the FATF standards. And I think here I also want to mention, Emil mentioned that assessing the risk and understanding the NPOs that are most at risk. During the mutual evaluation, what we saw in some of the countries that attempted to do national risk assessment notice of the NPOs appear to be in a hurry to quickly focus on religious NPOs, especially NPOs that are implementing measures regarding, Muslim, that is what they call Islamic NPOs. So they quickly focus on them. So these NPOs are Islamic NPOs and therefore at higher risk. These NPOs are receiving funds from X country and that put them at a greater risk. So the effort to quickly put in place something, or that is to rush to put in place these measures, also come up with the wrong information that is used as a basis for applying the FATF standards to NPOs. So in this case, they are not able to actually distinguish between exposure to terrorist financing and then the normal features of legitimate NPOs. That is those doing charitable work or humanitarian work. Then another aspect which I think Emil has already mentioned is not being able or not actually dialoguing with the NPOs. And the other side of this is also the NPOs themselves not dialoguing between each other. What we see is in some areas you have what they call the local NPOs and then the international NPOs. Even among the locals and the international, they are not even dialoguing among themselves. So the vulnerability remains within the pocket NPOs, and also some of them do not really belong to what we call the umbrella NPOs. Today we have pockets of them, fragmented funds and all that. So where there is no dialogue between them, the national authorities will also just use whatever information they have to conclude that the NPOs, all of them are at risk. I think for in some of the countries, what happened was that even the country's national risk assessment identified them as being of higher risk. And the banks also started de-risking, that is, to say that because they are at higher risk, they will not do any business with them. So this is these are some of the things that make the implementation quite difficult. Then we also have the institutional confusion. That is, we have several competent authorities dealing with NPOs, and they have different understanding of what NPO risks are about. So for instance, if the tax authorities don't know what the NPO risk is about, the FIU has a different idea. Let's say the ministry in charge of NPOs also has a different idea. And when these ideas are not put together, and when there's no dialogue between them, that also resulted in confusion. And especially we have, for instance, where some institutions decide to take the front and they also do not understand. They try to also impose their ideas on the national authorities, which the national authorities decide to act on, especially when approaching mutual evaluation, and they'll have to show something on paper that measures are being implemented. And then also, I've already mentioned insufficient dialogue among NPOs themselves, and also not being there for each other. That is where there is the lack of dialogue between the NPOs themselves. They are not even able to report each other, or where they feel that a certain NPO is at risk of TF, and for that matter, can cause problems for the other NPOs. I'll pause here, and then if there are any follow-ups that can be taken through the questions and answers.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Wood. I allowed you to go beyond the 3 minutes because these two questions are really what it is all about, to set the scene. And I think you have hammered the nail on the head. You have provided several reasons that may have led to this misunderstanding. The fact that countries are rushing for mutual evaluation, and they want to ensure that they do the risk assessment quickly to try to have a compliance or largely compliant rating. This may lead to the country not doing the risk assessment properly. Just looking at Islamic NPOs, and then you just say these are the high-risk NPOs, while you have not really done a very, very thorough risk assessment. She also mentioned the lack of dialogue, the lack of consultation, and also the lack of authorities actually taking time to really understand NPO operations. So there are several reasons, but I think institutions like Spaces for Change, Civil Advisory Hub, I think you have done quite a lot. It's quite commendable to try to bridge this gap. So thank you so much. So in this segment, I want to move next to Ms. Moremi. We want to look at the risk assessment process for non-profit organizations. And Ms. Moremi, we know that many countries treat the entire NPO sector as higher risk, as it has been mentioned by Ms. Wood and Emil. So the question is, why is this approach inconsistent with the FATF requirements? And how should countries identify and focus on the NPOs that face higher risk for effective monitoring?
Okay, thank you.
3 minutes.
Yeah. Thanks for giving me the floor, and good afternoon to everyone. I think to make the answer more clear and targeted, perhaps the starting point will be the key features of Recommendation 8. In terms of first identifying a subset of the NPOs that meet the FATF definition. And you'll recall that the FATF definition is a functional one, so it's focusing more on the activities and the characteristics of those NPOs that may put them at risk of being abused by either terrorist organizations or individual terrorists. So Once a country is able to identify the activities and characters that may put a particular NPO at risk, then the next step will then be to look at the nature and the threats that those NPOs may be exposed to. So, and then from there, you are then able to pick the most vulnerable NPOs, vulnerable in the sense that they may be abused for TF purposes. So those 3 steps are very critical in terms of getting it right and ensuring that when you now have to come up with measures, mitigating measures to reduce the risk, they're then targeted and focused and only on those specific NPOs. So the challenge has been with most jurisdictions in the global network has been identifying that subset, because the moment you're not able to identify it properly or accurately, then it means NPOs that are not supposed to be supervised or monitored for TF abuse then end up being in that basket. So this is where the inconsistency comes in, because now the supervision and oversight is overreaching and goes beyond what is supposed to be there, and then it ends up unduly disrupting legitimate activities of NPOs, and then also the issue of unintended consequences, which were alluded to by my colleagues earlier. So in terms of the risk assessment, it's important that we get the first steps right, and because it will have then a cascading effect on the mitigation measures that need to be put in place. So I think in short, I've tried and answered it by isolating the key features and showing how. Then that's how countries should actually implement to ensure that they're doing it in a manner that is consistent with the FATF requirements.
Thank you, Moremi. I think that is a very succinct but right to the point. Looking at the steps that are involved in the risk assessment process for NPOs, that is to look at the FATF definition. There is a specific definition by the FATF. Those that are involved mostly in raising and disbursing funds. So Victoria earlier in the first masterclass has given some examples from certain jurisdictions, how they went about it. In Nigeria here, the risk assessment was very consultative. A workshop was held, which brought together all the stakeholders in the identification process. And I think this is very, very important, because if you don't get this step right, it could lead to some unintended consequences later. So this is the main challenge that most countries face. So for countries that have not done this yet, maybe you can learn from Nigeria and some other countries. But you have to take time in the identification process so that you know this will be subject to the FATF recommendation, and these will be excluded. And from there, you assess, and those that are high risk, you ensure that the appropriate mitigating measures are put in place. So thank you very much, Moremi. I want to move to Bohit. Bohit from Gabak. And this question, you can either speak in English or French, Mr. Bohit rather. So I want to find out how should countries engage community-based organizations and those informal civil society actors, including those that may not be formally registered, when assessing NPO terrorist financing risk and designing appropriate measures. That is the engagement with civil society actors, community-based organizations, but also those NPOs that may not be formally registered when you are doing the national risk assessment for NPO in terms of terrorist financing. Thank you. So you have about 3 minutes.
Thank you, Soho. And I'm not very good in English, but I will try to do my best for the sake of efficiency, effectiveness. Before answering to the question, I would like to first of all thanks authorities, especially Nigerian authorities, for hosting the meeting, and the host of the activity for involving the GABAC Secretariat, as well as the SECFIN Africa for sponsoring GABAC Secretariat in this meeting. So, relating to the question, I think it is no need to come back to maybe to re-emphasize on targeted action, and I think colleagues have said enough on how adopt a targeted approach for the subset, as well as they said how to involve the sector in the risk assessment process. So now you have already a view on this point. I think I will focus on the proportionality of the engagement, the proportionality of the dialogue with the NPO sector. So normally, countries are expected having how can I say that a dialogue, which is proportionate with the risk level of any category, each category of NPOs. So the next element is to avoid to create, a conflict between informality and irregularity. I think most of the time, usually, people create this kind of confusion between these two words, and I think this is a misunderstanding that should be addressed as quick as possible. And so, because of I don't know, but being in the informal sector, in the informal context, doesn't mean systematically an irregular situation. We know the context of Africa, and we know main challenges faced by African countries. So this is why I think we should consider NPOs in the informal sector like normal NPOs without stigmatizing them. And the next element is about the practical engagement of NPOs, and especially those who are in informal sector. So for those who are in this informal sector, it is expected to have, how can I say that, because they are not able to discuss directly with competent authorities, or the country should approach, a high-level organization like association, coalition, umbrella organization, donor organization, as well as self-body regulatory authorities. And normally with those authorities, we are able to have enough data, enough information in order to elaborate your risk assessment. And for this point, I would like to highlight the lack of information about NPOs who are identified in an informal sector. It is a common challenge, right, in Africa, West Africa, and I think by approaching those authorities, it's possible to have relevant information, and then you could engage a discussion or a direct dialogue with those NPOs. So having said that, I think Those are the main ideas about the question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. A round of applause, please. I think your English is perfect. You don't need to speak in French. Your English is very perfect, and I think the delegates understood exactly what he said. And he highlighted the challenges in identification of those that are operating informally. And he proposed that collaboration with associations that know what is happening in the sector will be able to help the authorities to identify them and also try to see how they could be involved in the risk assessment. That is to try to understand the risks that they pose due to their informality and their operations. So thank you so much, Bohid. I just have another question. This time we want to move to the evaluation process itself and assessor expectations. And I want to pose this question to Ms. Wood, Gina. We know that there are some FATF recommendations that go beyond assessing the laws, the institution, the powers, but it has some elements of effectiveness that is to do with technical compliance, but it also has some elements of effectiveness, and recommendation 8 is actually one of them. So beyond the existence of laws and regulations, what evidence do assessors look for to determine whether a country is implementing recommendation 8 effectively, that is in practice? Thank you. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Sahu. When it comes to FATF Recommendation 8, like you've mentioned, we are not only looking at whether the country has laws and regulations, we are also, we are implementing, it should be a risk-based approach. When we say implementation, we are not looking at what you are doing, but what you also have in place that should convince the assessors that indeed the country meets the requirements of Recommendation 8. First, as we have mentioned several times, the risk assessment. The assessors will check whether the country has conducted the risk assessment of the MPO sector. And by the risk assessment, that will also look at, as I call her Kelly, sorry. When I saw Moreni, I said, I don't know this person. I know her as Kelly. As Kelly has mentioned, we will check whether the country has actually identified the MPOs that fall within the FATF definition. And we'll also check whether the country has actually, based on the information derived, whether the country has actually used that information to identify the subsets of the MPOs that are actually at risk by nature of their operations and all those kinds of things, and their characteristics and the rest, whether that makes them actually vulnerable to the financing of terrorism. We'll also look at application of the risk, we'll also look at the information that the country used in coming to the conclusion that these MPOs are at risk, that is whether it's higher risk or lower risk, that is whether they use law enforcement information, information from suspicious transaction reporting, information from task, all sorts of the credible sources of information in coming to a conclusion. As I mentioned earlier, for countries, they just zero in on Islamic MPOs and say that they are at higher risk. On what basis did you conclude that this set of MPOs are at higher risk of terrorist financing? Then we'll also have to look at whether the risk assessment actually informed the response to the actions taken. for instance, for recommendation 8, based on the risk assessment, you also have to assess the adequacy of laws and other measures to ensure that they are adequate for purpose, and based on the findings, whether you have enacted new laws, that is, whether the laws and regulations you have are actually based on the findings of the risk assessment. And this will determine whether indeed the country is implementing a risk-based approach. Then we also mentioned several times the issue of coordination and the use of information, where law enforcement and other competent authorities, the supervisors and the rest are also sharing information that is feeding into the risk assessment and all that. And that is also, for instance, if we are talking about the consistent implementation of the FATF standard that is on a risk-based approach. So if, for instance, you've conducted the risk assessment, you have come up with your monitoring matrix and all that, whether the monitoring information is also used to update the risk assessment. So you will have to be looking at regular updates of the risk assessment that is conducted. So for instance, we'll also be looking at whether there have been typologies reports on how how NPOs are used in moving funds and all that to finance terrorism. Then, as Bokit mentioned, we have to look at engagement with the sector. So the fact that we have some sectors operating informally does not necessarily mean that they operate illegally. I think from some of our evaluations, some of the NPOs are allowed to operate for a certain period of time before they are actually registered. So we'll have to look at all these areas, and then the countries will have to provide information, that evidence that they are indeed implementing a risk-based approach when it comes to TF, that is for recommendation 8. And this is what also feeds into what we call the immediate outcome 10 of the FATF methodology when assessing compliance, that is the effectiveness of the country's implementation of measures to prevent its NPO sector from abuse. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina. I think this is very, very comprehensive. That is from the assessor's lens. These are some of the things that will be looked out for. First of all, the risk assessment process, the credibility of the information sources, the engagement that was carried out in the process, information sharing mechanisms, law enforcement, NPOs. All of these are contained in the FATF methodology, but also how recommendation 8 actions also feed into immediate outcome 10, specifically 10.3, core issue 10.3, which looks at the NPO measures as well. Maybe Emil could just as a follow-up, because Gina has mentioned the risk assessment, which is the base, which is foundational. So I just want to know whether you could provide delegates with information on what actually makes an NPO risk assessment credible. What makes it credible, what makes it evidence-based, and also useful for guiding targeted and proportionate monitoring on the FATF Recommendation 8. That is what are the informations, what makes the risk assessment credible, useful, and evidence-based, so that it will benefit the country to comply with Recommendation 8. Thank you. 2 minutes. It's a follow-up question.
Thank you. And then I'll try and be very brief as well. Yes, and just a precursor. In fact, mutual evaluations, you see countries argue. I've conducted risk assessment. Why am I being rated as partially compliant and all that and all that? You get to see that a lot. But as generally said, when it comes to the assessment, it is not only about whether you've conducted a risk assessment or you have demonstrated an understanding of your risk. It goes beyond that. Yes, risk assessment is a foundation. If you don't get it right, every other thing, it has a cascading effect, negative impact on every other thing. To respond to your question, I'll mention largely 5 things that we should look out for in determining whether a risk assessment is credible, useful, and all that. The first is scoping. Scoping is critical. We've been saying it right from the first session that the FATF recommendation itself acknowledges that not all NPOs meet the definition, the functional definition of FATF. So some do not meet. So because of that, the first thing, if you want to see the credibility of a risk assessment of NPOs and all that, you want to see whether the scoping was done. Have they been able to differentiate between the NPOs that meet the FATF definition or not? Because you see some risk assessments, they lump all the NPOs together. So that first obligation for the countries to identify the ones that meet the FATF definition, they didn't do that. Once you don't do that, you are likely to put yourself in a situation where you are applying measures across board. Okay, so the first thing is scoping. Let's get our scoping right. Let's drop those that are not relevant to the FATF definition and focus on the ones that meet the FATF definition. The second one is evidence must be from multiple sources. During mutual evaluations, you come across countries that argue that, oh, our law enforcement, they have not investigated any TF case. So there is an absence of terrorism financing, and so why the NPO is safe and all that. But in conducting a comprehensive risk assessment, we must take note that we have various institutions with various mandates. And we say that it is important we all work together because we are looking at the security of the state. So in sourcing data to inform your risk assessment, we must look to all the institutions that hold various aspects of data. The FIC would have STRs, suspicious transaction reports. Now, law enforcement, those who do investigate, may have cases that they've investigated. We need all those information. Now, another critical source of information we sometimes miss is the intelligence institutions. Now, I've had a conversation with a country authorities, where SDRs on NPOs is nil or limited, very few. As for investigations, none. But when you engage the intelligence agencies, they will tell you they've come across series of the activities or potential activities of this abuse of NPOs and all that. But then they have a way to handle it. Now, because the institutions are not talking to each other, and because those who were conducting the risk assessment didn't do broad consultations, they were missing out this information. So the multiple sources of information is important in order to get the right data to be able to analyze, to come up with a very credible risk assessment. Not forgetting the NPO sector themselves. They are the people, and I keep on saying, they best understand their sector. And so you need to engage them. They'll be able to tell you the activities that they undertake. In fact, they can even tell you some of the inherent vulnerabilities or some of the activities that some of the NPOs take, which state authorities are not aware of. So we need to engage that. In all this, it is just to help us understand the risk dynamics so that we'll be able to work together to take appropriate mitigating measures. Then I would also say that the risk assessment itself must lead to actionable and proportionate outcomes. A credibility of a risk assessment must lead to actionable outcomes, because once it helps you to identify the risk, we would also want to see actions that have been taken to mitigate those risks. So what are the action plans? What are the mitigating measures that the risk assessment has come up with? The recommendations and all that. Is it in line with the risks identified? Because in some NRA, some risk assessment, you see that the risk is saying something else, and then the actions being taken to mitigate is also saying something else. There is no unity between these two, and that will not be a characteristics of a credible risk assessment. Now, another thing is, I would want to see, or largely would want to see whether the risk assessment has done the risk differentiation well. It is not for the risk assessment to say all the NPO sector are high risk. What we want to see is, have we been able to identify those that are most vulnerable? Because that is the focus of R8, targeted approach. So where a risk assessment after the process comes out with a conclusion to say, based on all this, the NPO sector is high risk. It can't be a credible, because then you are lumping everybody together. So risk differentiation, has it been able to identify the specific sector or the specific type of NPOs that are high risk via the characteristics, their nature, of activities, where they operate, geographical area, and all that. So that when we look at the risk assessment, when we go into it, we know that, oh, okay, among the nucleus of NPOs operating within the jurisdiction, these very ones are, or these very types are the most vulnerable to TF abuse, so that then informs risk mitigating measures. So in conclusion, I've mentioned 5 things that we will look out for, or for which all of us should look out for when we are conducting our risk assessment. Number 1, scoping, to declassify and to ensure that we are targeting those that matter. 2, evidence from multiple sources. Don't just focus on evidence from the FIU. Don't just focus on evidence on law enforcement. We don't have investigations, so it is safe. No, it must be all encompassing. Look at all sources of information, even open sources of information from credible ones, of course, and factor it into the process. 3, risk differentiation. The assessment should tell us the type of NPOs that are most vulnerable. It should not be a whole, like all the NPO sector is vulnerable, as we sometimes see in risk assessment. And then 4, consultation with NPO sector. I keep highlighting that because it is important. Even during mutual evaluations, Gina will attest, they do consult the NPO sector themselves to see their level of engagement in all these processes. So where a risk assessment is conducted without engagement of the NPO sector players themselves, that cannot be a characteristic of a good risk assessment. And then the last one, the risk assessment must lead to actionable, proportionate outcomes. Where we know lower risk, you need to get a certain measure that is not disruptive, intrusive, and all that, so that the limited resources you have, as the economists will say, will be focused on the high risk or the most vulnerable ones. So these are 5 elements that I think we should look out for when we are trying to verify the credibility of a risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emil. Very, very comprehensive. So we move on quickly. I've been notified that I'm not doing very well in timekeeping or management. So I move to Moremi in under 2 minutes. Under 2 minutes. Given the importance of the mutual evaluation exercise, how can FSRBs, such as SMLAG, GABAC, GIABA, provide practical support to our member states before and after mutual evaluations, that is to improve understanding and implementation of recommendation 8. 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I'll try. I think first, just to say, as FSRBs or FATF style regulatory bodies, we are role players, or we are key partners to our member countries, and also in terms of ensuring the accurate application of the FATF standard and assessment. So our role tends to be more than just carrying out assessments of member countries, but they also involve capacity building and providing technical assistance. So this is done before the mutual evaluation itself, and then also post the assessment of the country. So in terms of technical capacity building or technical assistance, we have several trainings. First will be the assessor training, where assessors are taken through specific requirements and the accurate and appropriate interpretation of the recommendation 8 requirements. And then we also have regional workshops where issues such as the regional typologies, best practices, and key deficiencies identified within the region are then shared with across the membership, and then guidance is also provided in terms of how to cure those deficiencies. And then the other one is also when the country approaches the mutual evaluation process, there is also in-country technical assistance that's usually provided to the country on a need basis. So you find that recommendation 8 and immediate outcome 10 in relation to NPOs also become one of the key areas where a lot of countries are showing the need to be guided. So you'll then have those targeted in-country capacity building workshops where you then take them through the specific issues that are peculiar to recommendation 8, and in terms of the country preparing itself in demonstrating that they're actually applying proportionate measures to the NPO sectors. So now, following the assessment, there will then be key recommended actions for the country and then a roadmap for implementation of priority areas. Then also, as a follow-up to that process, as an FSRB, you'll then also follow up with the country in terms of the progress that the country is making in addressing those deficiencies, and then giving specific guidance depending on the key recommended actions. So if they're specific to NPOs, then it will also be targeted in relation to what the country needs to do to improve to address any issues or any deficiencies that we have identified during the assessment. So that's the support that we usually give to member countries. So it's an ongoing support and capacity building role that we do as the mutual evaluation cycle goes. So it's before and after, and then before and after. So the cycle goes on and on. So that's one cycle.
Thank you so much. So the role of the FSRB is not only to conduct the evaluation or to assess countries, but to also guide them, understand the standards, provide them with training, ensure the country has assessors that are trained, that understand the standards, do pre-mutual evaluation training, but also in the course of the evaluation, the FSRB also plays a key role in ensuring there is correct interpretation of the standards in the whole process. And after the evaluation, the FSRB is still trying to help the country implement the key recommended actions and also ensure that there are targeted interventions. And these are carried out in the work plan of the FSRB, that is to do capacity building and some other intervention that will help the country to address that deficiency. So given that this masterclass is not only for the panelists, I would just at this point in time try to close. But before we close, I want the panelists to provide some interventions on the road ahead, looking ahead. And I want to start with Ms. Wood Kina. Maybe we can do this under 2 minutes each. That is, if you could identify one practical reform that countries should prioritize before the next round of evaluation aimed at strengthening implementation of R8 or Recommendation 8, what would that practical reform be and why? That is, if you should identify one practical reform that countries should prioritize, what is that practical reform and why do you think it is important? 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Taho. I believe the rest will also add. Because, well, we have come a long way and we have seen a lot of progress. If I should recommend one practical reform, that would be to continue updating the risk assessments that have been conducted. Because a higher risk or a lower risk NPO today can become a higher risk NPO tomorrow. So if we continue updating the risk assessment, we will also continue updating our understanding and also continue applying the risk-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Continue assessing, reassessing the risk from time to time. And I heard this morning Victoria said Nigeria is currently undergoing that process. This is very, very critical to ensure that we understand the dynamics, because changes could happen over a period of 3 to 4 years. A low risk NPO could move to a high risk. So thank you for that one practical reform. I think the delegates have taken note. Reflections from Moremi. I want to find out what's the other name? KB. Kelly. Okay. Reflections from Kelly, Ms. Moremi. What practical advice would you give to the NPO regulators, the civil society organizations, and other AML CFT authorities on preparing for future assessments, but also ensuring that recommendation 8 measures remain effective, proportionate, and respectful of the civic space? 2 minutes, please.
Okay. I think first of all, I'll start just by reiterating that recommendation 8 is not about restricting civil society activities. I think that's the starting point. And the second point is, if you look at it carefully, it's actually intended to benefit the NPOs themselves, in the sense that it protects that subset that is most vulnerable to TF abuse, from being abused by terrorist organizations or individuals. But it also safeguards the legitimate activities of the NPOs as a whole. So if you look at it from that point of view, it's actually meant to benefit the NPOs more than it is to restrict civil society activities. So as a takeaway, I think key message, I think countries that tend to do well in relation to recommendation 8 are those that are able to demonstrate that they understand the risks and that are posed to a subset of NPOs that fall within the FATF definition. And they also are able to demonstrate that on a consistent, in a sustainable manner, not as an event-based, step also. They're able to show sustainable outreach and engagement with the civil society sector. So that way, if a country is able to demonstrate those two, it's very easy to then show that the measures that they put in place are proportionate to the risks that are identified, and are also able to speak to the NPOs, the types of NPOs, and the protection and the safeguards that are in place to ensure that they're not at risk of being abused for TF. So that will be my key message. Yeah.
Thank you for that very succinct message. Bohit, and this one is for both Bohit and Emil. That is looking ahead to the next round of mutual evaluations. What trends or emerging expectations should countries prepare for in implementing recommendation 8? And also, in one sentence, what is the single biggest misconception? The single biggest misconception about recommendation 8 that countries should move away from? Thank you. 2 minutes.
Thank you. So I'll be very, very short. So for me, the key element for the next round of mutual evaluations is to keep in mind that NPO's measures should be consistent with the human rights. First element. Second element, the proportionality is very, very important. Proportionality of measures. And when I talk about proportionality, it is related to the level of risk. Higher risk, enhanced measures. Lower risk, simple measures. And that's very, very important. And I think one of the key elements is also the three-sectorial engagement between NPOs, self-regulatory bodies, as well as financial institutions in order to avoid the risking and and avoiding exclusion for the financial system. So coming back to the let's say bad practice or bad idea, I think countries should avoid to consider the NPO sector as, let's say, FIs or DNFUPs, like reporting entities. Measures are a little bit different, and I think it should be calibrated for this sector. Another element is to consider the whole sector as a higher risk. This is, I think, a misunderstanding of the standard of FATF. So that would be my last word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bohit. Thank you. And the same question to Emil. That is the what should countries look out for in the new round of evaluation, and also what is the single biggest misconception that we should avoid? Thank you. In 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So that I will not be the one standing in between the people having their lunch. I would, yes. Now, based on our experience from the second round of mutual evaluations, especially within West Africa, as we go into the third round, based on what we have seen in the last round and what is expected of us in the next round, I will highlight some 4 key things. One, the expectation, quality of risk understanding is one. During the last round of mutual evaluation, you had situations where assessors, when they were engaging countries, then you see somebody come and say, oh, the risk assessment report was given to me a day before. You know, that's from the country. It was just given to me a day before, so I don't even know what is inside. Meanwhile, this is somebody the country has designated to meet assessors and demonstrate that the country actually understands their risks. So that is what you must look out for. Next round, quality of risk understanding, and that must cut across the stakeholders. 2, proportionality of measures. No one size fits all. We've all agreed that right from the onset, there is a shift. So not one size fits all. Proportionality of measures. High risk, focus attention. Low risk, minimal attention. Then engagement with the NPO sector. Last round, there was little or no engagement with the NPO sector in the conduct of national risk assessment and also during the mutual evaluation. That is what we'll be looking at for. So we must go back and correct that. The NPO sector should not only be engaged during national risk assessment, they must be engaged also during the mutual evaluation process. In fact, in everything that relates to the NPO sector, we must put it as a must for us to engage the NPO sector. Then evidence of unintended consequences. That is also one that we must look out for. Are we implementing measures that is resulting in unintended consequences? One way to be able to get that is to work well with the NPOs. They go to transact. So they sometimes pick out whether the measures we have put in place on paper is actually achieving results or rather working against the sector. So when we do these collaborations, we'll be able to pick out some of these unintended consequences and correct them even before the mutual evaluation. When it comes to misconception, quickly, the recommendation 8 does not require countries to treat the NPO sector as a threat. Rather, we must see them as partners in enhancing the security of the state and also in terms of socioeconomic development of the state, because they play a critical role. Let us see them as partners in achieving this than rather see them as a threat when it comes to terrorism financing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let us treat them as partners in development. The message is very clear. Thank you to all the panelists. And at this point in time, we can open the floor for questions. I think we can take maybe maximum of 4. I'm sure these discussions will continue during the course of the week, and there will be a lot more engagement on these issues. So we can take a maximum of 4 questions, and then we can break for lunch. So we have 1 question from there,
Okay.
2 here,
3.
3. All of them are female. Where are the male?
I think it's good.
The male are confused or they understood everything? Huh? Everything is well understood from our side. Okay. So we have 3 questions. Okay, that's fine. So we can take 3 and then we break. Okay.
Thank you, our panelists, for those great perspectives on these issues. I just have a quick question, and starting off from Mr. Emil's point, recognizing NPOs as partners in the measures that are being taken to be effective and proportionate. When I listened to Madame Moremi, she talked about the capacity building efforts that are done, for instance, pre-mutual evaluations. And I'm curious, how much capacity building initiatives target NPOs? Because if we are going to regard them as partners, it's important that there's a balanced approach in a lot of these efforts. Thank you.
First one is talking about the evidence from multiple sources. Our experience here in Nigeria was that when we went on the field and we conducted the interviews, because the process was so transparent to the extent that we moved along with the NPOs, even to the offices of security personnel. And some of the information they were giving to us, because it was not, will I say, palatable to them, some of them even refused to reflect it in their reports. And when we came back, they said, oh no, those guys are just politicians. They are just talking politics. And I said, if you do say that law enforcement agencies' source of information is no longer credible, then where else do we go to? We experienced the same thing with the government officials in the Northeast. When they gave us certain information, the NPOs will kick against it and said, no, what they are saying is not correct. So we had that back and forth because their position was that those issues were not prosecuted to the latter. So my question now is that when you say we should collect information from multiple sources, I know open source is also, some are credible. So must those information be tested all the way to the courtroom and come back? So I think this is the misunderstanding that exists with some of the NPOs. For Nigeria, we still reflected those facts in our case studies. Please, the second question. The description of at-risk NPOs, largely on what they do, the features and characteristics. Now, I want to know from the experts, must we pin a name to the different at-risk NPOs we identified, other than to say that NPOs that undertake so type of activities are termed at risk, and we go through our database and we're able to identify them. But in the report, are we expected to now put out their names out there? Thank you.
It's good that the mic has come to me just after that question, because my question was almost a flip of what the lady before me has just asked, which is to what really trying to understand how we balance those multiple sources of evidence, those multiple sources of information. From looking at different risk assessments from different countries, you will notice that the recommendations of the evidence that's shared by law enforcement, which sometimes law enforcement themselves claim is not backed by evidence. They just say that most nonprofits are at risk. If you look at the Kenya report, it frequently highlights that that NPOs are not credible without a source of background, without case information. I'm sure they share more with the regulators, of course, but at the same time, our national risk assessment, will target nonprofit or the sectoral. We'll speak to nonprofits. but that evidence is typically not highlighted at all. From law enforcement, you have direct quotes from every single agency. Typically, every single agency, they will put direct quotes of what each of them said. So how are we balancing that kind of evidence, those multiple sources? Do you have standards that you're sharing for how the countries will identify those sources of information? Because it's really not about quantity and really more about quality. I think to answer a question on whether, on how many nonprofits we need, I don't think it's really a numbers game, or sometimes it could be, but really it's about the quality of information we're getting. Just to ask, what kind of standards are you setting around that, around how that information is organized? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I will hand over to the panelists. Maybe I'll start with Moremi on the question relating to the targeted intervention by the FSRB, the capacity building issues, and whether there is enough capacity building for NPOs. And the other questions are really about information sources and the conflict between the perspective of the NPO and law enforcement information, and the other questions are all related to that. So Moremi, you could start off, and then maybe Emil or Gina or any other panelists could intervene. Thank you.
I think, in short, in terms of the capacity building initiatives, FSRBs, we usually participate in different capacity building. This is one of them, if I may give it as an example, where we share insights and best practices and the appropriate application of the recommendation 8 requirements. But at a more granular level, let me take, for example, when we are conducting an in-country training. So there will be sessions which are targeted purely to recommendation 8, and then usually you will then have the NPO sector having representatives attending those programs. And those are very crucial in terms of getting a better understanding of the types of NPOs that are in that jurisdictions, the activities that they undertake, and also in relation to where they are located in the country. Because remember, some of the issues might be arising out of the geographical context of a particular jurisdiction. So you want to also be sure to ensure that they shared understanding between the country in terms of ensuring that measures are in place, but also the NPOs understanding the context within which, or the location with which they are, and usually regional typologies, and there are so many emerging trends and patterns either shared by FATF, by the region, or in neighboring countries, risk assessment or financial intelligence units, typologies, studies. They usually become very crucial in terms of now showing the risks that may be posed to those specific NPOs. So it's not just workshops where we come and we engage with the country, but it's inbuilt into the capacity building program at regional level and at country level. The other one that we did, if I may give an example, for the SAMLAC, we had a horizontal review of the implementation of recommendation 8 within the SAMLAC region, in the Eastern Southern African part, region. So in that horizontal review, NPOs were an integral part of that review. So in terms of sharing lessons and also issues, best practice issues, we had NPOs. In fact, we had more than 50 representatives from the NPO sector within the Eastern Southern African region. So it was quite a comprehensive exercise, and in that you also get to now learn and share experiences in terms of implementation of recommendation 8. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Moremi. Emil?
Yeah, thank you. So let me just add to what Moremi said, especially when it comes to the multiple sources. We know that First of all, it is a misconception to suggest that only data that should be factored into the process should be ones that have resulted in investigation and prosecution and all that. That is not accurate. Intelligence is important. Sometimes it may be intelligence today, but it will result in investigation, prosecution tomorrow, and you are doing the assessment today. You don't have that luxury of time to wait until it is fully investigated and prosecuted and all that. So intelligence is key. And in fact, when it comes to, remember the NPO sector, largely, we are talking about terrorism financing. And when it comes to terrorism financing, intelligence is very important. Very, very important. So that is one. Two, yes, when it comes to sourcing data, we have people who will merely express their perceptions, which is not backed by any evidence. Some would have their biases and all that. It's also, when we are doing our normal research and all that, we come across some of these things. So it is important we do some triangulation of the data that we are collecting, do some kind of verification. Where are the sources? What is the credibility of those sources? Can we test that information vis-a-vis other sources? So for example, TF, we have STRs, investigations, typology reports, we have other international organizations that have conducted assessments and all that. So when we get this information, it is important we try to run through all these other to see whether there is some level of credibility to this information. It is not enough to just say because the NPO said that information is not correct, we should not factor it into the process. Sometimes NPOs end up being a bit defensive. And that happens because most often they lack understanding of what we are doing. Remember, the purpose of the risk assessment is first of all to the benefit of the state. It should not, the focus should not be because it is a FATF requirement. No, it is about the security of the state. So as much information that can help us to be able to conduct an effective assessment, that would ensure that the state put in place measures so that we can come and sit here today and have this conversation is important. You know, so we would encourage NPOs. That is why it is good to do consultation with the NPO sectors even before national risk assessment. Because where all of you have a common understanding of what is expected of us as a state and also in relation to the FATF recommendation, then we would be able to move beyond some of these, because then they think that if you factor in that information, you end up targeting them. But that is not actually the purpose. It is to help us understand the system or the sector so that we'll be able to take appropriate measures. I think capacity building, let me add something. Capacity building should not only be one-way directional. It should not always be the FSRB or the state building your capacity. The NPOs should also be able to engage the state actors, for example, and tell them, oh, we want to brief you on some of the measures we are putting in place as NPOs. We want to brief you on some of the measures the state has put in place, but which is resulting in something else, unintended consequences and all that. So don't wait for the state to come and build your capacity. You should be able to engage the state and also inform them about some of the measures you are implementing. Because in putting in place the mitigating measures, there is a need for us to also factor in measures already in place or measures already taken by the NPO sector themselves, which would also result in us mitigating the TF vulnerabilities. So let us see ourselves as partners. I think, let me just end it because of time. Thank you.
Members did 2 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to clarify that when we talk about the NPO sector, we're not only talking about those on the ground implementing those programs, we are also talking about the donor community. So the outreach is also to the donor community so that we have the same level of information to use for the NPO risk assessment. I'd like to also add to where I think we mentioned where there's a conflict between information that the competent authorities have and what the NPOs have. In this situation, the authorities don't have to be confrontational with the NPOs. They'll have to sit with them and discuss the sources of information, and also to align what they have with what the NPOs have. Let them understand that they are partners, as we have emphasized, they are partners, and trying to reach a common goal. I believe Nigeria is very proud, and I think it's not only the government that is proud that Nigeria is the only country that is rated compliant on recommendation 8. This is a shared pride, and I believe it is very important to discuss with the NPOs. Also, the NPOs will have to, as I mentioned, it's partnership. So the NPOs themselves should also engage with the authorities and also among themselves to ensure the harmonization of information. All these things are intended to also build trust and also build public confidence, because for FATF Recommendation 8, the countries are supposed to put in place measures that will also build trust in the activities of the NPOs. And finally, I'd like to say that we should not be oblivious of the fact that the international community also may have similar information on the NPO sector. And where, for instance, the country provides wrong information, the international community can also question the country, the assessment team, why they are using that kind of information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to all the delegates for your kind attention. This actually brings the session to a close. Spaces for Change maybe could come to do some announcement. But thank you. These discussions will continue during the course of the week. The panelists are available. You could engage them over lunch or in the free time during the course of the week. And they will also be sitting in other sessions as well. So thank you so much. Spaces for Change. Maybe if you have any announcements to make. You're done. Thank you so much.
Please.